So I have been using the Garmin Epix Gen 2 Sapphire and the Garmin Fenix 7X Solar Sapphire for exactly a month now. And in this video, I'm going to share with you the important points that you need to know if you are considering buying one of these watches, coming from the perspective of somebody who hikes a lot and enjoys the outdoors. All right, to start, why am I talking about two watches? Well, the Fenix 7 and the Epix Gen 2 are basically the same watch. The Epix Gen 2 is the same as a medium Fenix. I have the Fenix, the large one, the 7X, but generally it's the same guts, it's the same operating system. There's two major differences. First, the Epix has an AMOLED screen, which is a bright, vivid, full-color screen like you'd find on an Apple Watch. The Fenix 7 has the transflective screen, which needs some external light in order for you to see it. It's the same as the Fenix 6 and the Fenix 5. If you're familiar with those. So different screens on these watches. Now, the other big thing is the battery life. The Fenix 7, because it has this transflective screen, which chews less battery, lasts a lot longer than the Epix watch does. The Epix still has a respectable battery life, but the Fenix has a much better battery life. You can also get a solar model with the Fenix that gives you even more battery life, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, and I'll also mention that in my recommendations. The Fenix might be a better choice for you if you really need a long battery. Now, the important thing to know about all of the different Fenix and Epix models, and there are a couple dozen of them or a few dozen of them, is that you want to get a Sapphire model. Now, the Sapphire models have a few important differences that I think really pay off, especially in the outdoors. And my way of looking at it is if you're already going to spend like a lot of money on this, adding another 100 or two to the watch in order to get the best one is probably worth your time, probably worth the resale value as well. But the Sapphire models on both of these offer, number one, sapphire glass, which is more scratch resistant, better for the outdoors if you're out banging around. The other thing is that they offer more memory, so they have 32 gigs internal storage instead of 16 gigs on non-Sapphire models. What that means is that you can load more maps onto here, you can record more activities, you can save music if that's your thing, or you could load a bunch of GPX tracks onto it. So I get a lot of questions over the years about the Fenix models. Can I load the entire PCT onto the Fenix? I'd say with the Sapphire model, 32 gigs, you can definitely do that and be okay. The other thing, which is probably the most important feature on the Sapphire, is that it has the multi-band GPS. And I'll talk about the GPS in detail in a second, but that's the one that's basically the best kind of consumer GPS you can get at the moment on your wrist. The Sapphire has it, the other ones don't. The other ones are still respectable, but the Sapphire is much better, especially in challenging conditions. So that's what we're talking about. So first off, this is a hiking channel, and if you're wondering if you need one of these watches to enjoy the outdoors, the answer is absolutely not. This is a luxury item, and in addition to the outdoors functionality like navigation and tracking hikes, there are literally hundreds of other things you can do with these watches. You know, you can do weight training, track your weight training, high intensity cardio. You can get apps on here that do almost anything, get the tides, whatever it might be, track paddleboarding. There's a million things you can do with these watches. So unless you are doing those things and tracking your health, tracking your sleep, your heart rate, your respiration, and you care about that, this is going to be overkill. You can get a much cheaper watch that just has some basic navigation, plots you on a track, and does all of that. And I'll dive into recommendations at the end, but I just wanted to put that out there. This is a luxury item, and unless you are using all of the health features that are available, I don't really think one of these is worth it. Now, there's two health features I just wanted to briefly call out. One is the body battery, and I've used a Fenix for years and years and years. Body battery is essentially a gas tank for your body. It's become fairly accurate over the years, and you wake up in the morning, you sync your watch, and you look at this figure, and it's somewhere between 0 and 100, and you know, it'll theoretically tell you, according to your exercise load, your heart rate, a bunch of different factors, your HRV, how much gas you have in your tank. So I find that helpful if I am trying to rest up for maybe a big hike or a big adventure. That'll give me a little bit of a gauge of where I am in terms of, you know, my energy level in my body. One other quick tip with that, if I wake up and I feel pretty good, but my body battery is usually low, I found that that's a sign that I might be getting sick, and I'll pop a bunch of like immunity vitamins, and I do pretty well at sort of heading off a sickness when my body battery is low, but I feel good. I've gotten my body battery down to 5, haven't gotten it lower than that, so I don't think it necessarily goes lower than that, but still a good feature. Now there's a new feature on the new watches, on these watches, called Stamina, and Stamina is essentially a body battery for when you're exercising. So if I'm going out on a 10-hour hike and I want to know if I want to pace myself, maybe I have like, you know, 5 climbs, and I want to make sure I'm not going too hard on the early climbs so that I have some gas left in the tank at the end, there's a thing called Stamina. Unfortunately, that is not available right now with hiking. Maybe in the future it will be, but it's available for things like biking and running. All right, let's talk about the new multi-band GNSS systems on these watches, which is probably one of the more exciting things for somebody who loves the outdoors. First of all, just know that there are 3 settings on these watches for the positioning. There's GPS only, there's multi-GNSS, which includes Galileo, GPS, GLONASS, Baidu, QZSS, and with those over 100 different satellites in the sky available to you on the Fenix 6, you could either do GPS and Galileo or GPS and GLONASS, so much more variety of satellites to choose from now. And then the third setting is multi-GNSS and multi-band. And multi-band is basically different signals from the same GPS satellites. The newer, or the different signals, are newer signals that are better encoded, sometimes stronger. I have a full deep dive on that and some other videos on GPS and the technology behind it. I'm not going to dive into that here. I'll put links to that again under the video if you want to learn about more about what multi-band is. But essentially, or effectively, what it is it gives you a little bit more accuracy and also a little bit more reliability, especially when you are in challenging conditions like a slot canyon. I'm not going to dive into all of the GPX tracks and everything. I've used this in comparison with a few other GPS units over the last month, and let me just tell you what my findings are. First, when you have all of the multi-GNSS and multi-band on, this unit locks onto a satellite much quicker. So when you go to track your hike, in the old days with my Fenix, a month ago with my Fenix 6, you know, it might take up to a minute or 2 to lock onto the GPS. With this, it's like 10 to 15 seconds top. So it's a sign that there's many more satellites and many more signals to choose from. That is great. The other great thing is that when you have multi-GNSS and multi-band enabled, the accuracy and reliability are much better than not, especially when you're in challenging conditions. So slot canyons, deep canyons, gullies, you know, cliffside wall, like you're hiking down the Bright Angel Trail in the Grand Canyon, something like that. This is going to work better because it has the multi-band, which can help detect if there's signals bouncing off of a canyon wall. It'll help get rid of those sort of bad signals. And also there's many more satellites in the sky to choose from. So if they're blocked on this side from a canyon wall, you're going to have many more on this side to help trilaterate your position. So the multi-band works great and gave me very accurate results. In fact, it gave me basically the same results as my handheld multi-bands, which are the GPS Map 66SR and GPS Map 65S. Same performance as the handhelds in the wearable, much smaller package, so that's truly amazing and truly great. And when I actually hike, unless I'm really trying to conserve battery for some reason, which generally I'm not, I will always have the multi-band on. Now, the other surprising thing that I found out is that when I'm not in challenging environments like a canyon or, you know, against a wall, if I turn multi-band off and just have multi-GNSS on, I get almost the same tracks as I do with multi-band. Multi-band only really helps when I'm in a really challenging environment, which generally I find to be, you know, big faces of rocks against me, not necessarily heavy tree cover. In heavy tree cover, they perform basically the same as they would without it, and I tested this in the Pacific Northwest for a few days in the rain and cloudy conditions and the cold, and it was fine. So if you do want to save a little bit of battery, the multi-band chews more battery than when you have it on than when you don't have it on. So if you know you're not going to be in those challenging environments and you want to save battery, just using multi-GNSS gives you basically the same results as multi-bands in regular environments. So very, very cool. Lastly, and maybe not surprisingly, when I just had GPS on, it was pretty horrible. It was definitely off the track a lot of the times. The other thing to note is that you can get a GPS elevation. So normally the elevation from these comes from the barometric altimeter, but you can also get a GPS elevation when you have 4 more satellites, which is pretty easy to do on these watches. Generally, that was not great. With the multiband, it got better, and it's the same on these watches, basically the same as it was, again, on the handhelds like the GPS Map 66 SR. The elevation accuracy I got was routinely within 5 to 10 feet for the GPS elevation, which is incredible. And effectively on the trail, that means that I can have a GPS elevation and on my watch and kind of know where I am based on the elevation and get a gauge of where I'm climbing based on the elevation. So very accurate, very cool. I'm very, very happy with the positioning and the elevation from the GPS on this watch. It's great. While we're talking about positioning, let's talk about the ABC sensors, the altitude, barometer, and compass. They basically work exactly the same as they did on my Fenix 6. I don't think the chipset or the logic is any different there. They're fairly accurate and they work as you would expect, but nothing groundbreaking there. The biggest surprise on these two watches for me was the screen. Let's talk about the touchscreen first. So these are both touchscreen, and I was a little weary at first because touchscreens in adverse conditions aren't usually great. The nice thing is that you can turn the touchscreen off on these, and by default it's off for activities, and you can turn it on or off for an activity. So if you want to have paddleboarding or water sport, you can turn the touchscreen off so that it doesn't accidentally get hit or messed with by the water. That said, the performance of these touchscreens in the rain is much better than the touchscreen Montana unit, much better than like a cycling edge unit, which when they get soaked or there's heavy rain, the screens just go crazy and you have to lock the screen. I found that using the touchscreen on these watches in the rain was spectacular, and I was surprised by that. I don't know if it's the sapphire glass, but the performance in the rain is great, and you don't need the touchscreen to operate the watch. The watch operates with the buttons only, just like the Fenix 6 did, so if you don't want to use a touchscreen, you don't have to. Now, where I found the touchscreen to come in handy was on the map. On the old Fenix, if you're familiar with it, you could pan and zoom, but you had to use buttons and kind of cycle through pan mode and zoom mode. With the new watches, with the Fenix 7 and Epix, you do not have to do that. You can just move around with your finger, you can long press on the map, and you can zoom using the buttons on the side. And effectively on the trail, what that meant was if I came to a junction and I maybe wanted to look around, or I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper into my surroundings without having to take out a paper map just to glance down, I was going to the map much more often than I was on the older Fenix models, which were just a total pain to use. With this, it was easy just to move my finger around and check it all out. When the map is zoomed in to like a level that you would use hiking or trail running or just sort of local with maybe a mile, the scrolling is nice and smooth. The redraws are much quicker than they were on the old map. If you zoom way out, it doesn't sort of dumb the detail level down. It looks like it's trying to load a lot of stuff in, and it's much harder to zoom and get a redraw on the map. It's really slow if you're really zoomed out, but not a huge deal for me. But overall, the touchscreen worked great. Now, the one thing to know is that when you have the map on the screen, it's the biggest battery drain on the watch, or doing calculations or zooming around and like drilling down on places on the touchscreen. So if you're using the map, use it sparingly. I'll talk about battery rate in a little bit, but if you use it, don't leave it on when you're hiking or running or whatever. Go to a screen like a data screen, use the map when you need to, otherwise take it off of the watch face and you'll save a little bit of battery. Now, the biggest surprise for me was the screen colors, and I didn't think it was going to be a surprise. So the Epix, again, has 65,000 colors per pixel. It's an AMOLED screen, so it's always on. The Fenix is transflective. You need some sort of external light in order to see the pixels correctly, and it only has 64 colors per pixel. I didn't think it was going to be a big deal, but I found myself looking at the Epix much more just because the screen looks so much better. It's brighter, it's easier to read. There's one thing, if you've had a Fenix before, that I just sort of forgot about with my old Fenix, and that's when you lift it up, you always have to just move it around a little bit if it's not in the perfect light. If it's not reflecting light perfectly, you have to adjust a little bit in order to see it correctly. And taking that little adjustment and that little mental exercise out of the workflow and just looking up and having it work is a game changer. Having both of these on my wrists, I never looked at the Fenix. I always just look at the Epix now, and that was a huge surprise for me. Now, that bright screen comes at a cost. This burns much more battery than the Epix transflective screen. And I'll talk about battery in a little bit. There are some things that you can do to minimize the battery burn on the Epix if you want to go with that one. First, there's a setting called Always On. Some people refer to it as gesture mode. The idea is that when you're holding it up, the watch detects that and the screen gets brighter. When I'm putting it down, the watch gets dimmer and it burns less battery. You can switch that mode off so that when the watch goes down, the screen turns off. And it's a great way to save battery. The only problem is that when you lift it, there's about a second before the screen comes on. I hope Garmin maybe makes this quicker if they can in a new firmware update. It's just like a little noticeable. It's not as quick as an Apple Watch in terms of that gesture mode. It's like a second that you have to wait. It's still better than doing the shuffle on the Fenix to try to get the right amount of sunlight. Now, effectively having the better screen on the Epix means that the maps look much better. There's also more pixels on the screen on the Epix than on the Fenix in terms of the size. It's almost double, a little bit less than double amount of pixels in the Epix, which gives you a higher pixel density, which means that you can display more detail on the screen even at the same zoom level. So at a mile zoom on the Fenix and a mile zoom on the Epix, you'll see trail names on the Epix that you won't see on the Fenix unless you zoom in more. So for the outdoors, having this better screen translated into better information that was available at a quick glance. All right, so let's talk about the maps. Now, if you get a Sapphire Edition, the maps from your region will be preloaded onto the watch. Even if you don't have that, you can load maps from all over the world onto the watches. You can do it now through the watch directly, so you don't have to sync it with a computer, which is great. There's a map manager app on here, and you can basically download as many maps as you can fit onto your device. Now, the caveat is that it has to be plugged in when you do this, and it takes quite a long time. I think the Europe map set is like 11 gigs or something, and it takes 3 or 4 hours to download depending on your connection and the server on the Garmin side, but never super quick to download it onto here, but still really powerful and really great. If you travel a lot, you can load multiple maps on here. The maps are the Garmin Topo Active maps. Now, I used to load OpenStreetMaps onto my Garmin's because the trail coverage was much better. These new version of the Topo Active maps are great. All the trails from the national level to the local level here in California at least are on there. I don't need to load other maps on there. The level of detail is great and they just work, which is a good thing. The less sort of messing around with computers and loading and syncing that I have to do, the better. I can just get this out of the box and start using the map. So very, very cool, and kudos to the Garmin cartography team. They really have good coverage and they really understand what's a real trail and not a real trail most of the time. So that's a great feature of these maps. So all the maps are routable. You can create courses, you can drop waypoints, you can customize the map theme so it looks different based on what your preferences are. Really, really powerful. You can change the level of detail on the maps. All powerful tools that will help you kind of get the most out of them. I'll make another video on navigating with this. Just know that if you are syncing, there's 2 ways to sync this. You can sync with Garmin Connect, which is the health and fitness ecosystem for Garmin, and Garmin Explore, which is the sort of outdoors and navigation ecosystem. I wish they were all in one. Maybe they will be at some point. But if you save a waypoint on the watch, that'll sync with Garmin Explore, not with Garmin Connect. But otherwise, if you record a hike or a track of any kind, it will sync with either one of those systems that you may use. And again, navigating the map is as easy as moving around with the touchscreen. You can also still do it with the buttons if you've disabled the touchscreen, but you can move around the map. You zoom with the arrow keys, with the plus and minus, sorry, on the side, and you can long press on a point on the map and navigate it to it, drop a waypoint, get some information about it, just like you would, I guess, on a smartphone. The redraws, again, are almost as good as a smartphone, a little bit laggier, especially if you're zoomed out, but overall, the maps, especially for the outdoors, are great. The main method of navigating with the watch is something called a course, and a course has been around for a while, but if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially a route kind of mixed in with a little bit of a track. You follow the line. If you go off the line, it'll give you a alert. If you have a sharp turn coming up, it'll give you an alert. You can turn those alerts on and off. I've found that having the turn alert on will give me a notification every time there's a switchback or something. It's pretty annoying, so I'll turn that off in the settings. The off course and on course can be the same thing. If you lose your GPS and you go, where the trail is a different course than what you planned out, you'll get an off course alert, but you can set those and get notifications when you are on and off the course. A new feature is up ahead, and that allows you to add points along the course. You can think of them like little waypoints for different things, like maybe a water source or a checkpoint or a bathroom or, a supply cache, whatever it might be. You can do those, and you have a little screen on the watch as part of the cycling through the screens here that shows you how far away the next course points are. This is awesome. This I found works great. I'd put springs in, I'd put trail junctions, and I can just kind of glance down and say, okay, I have another 1.1 miles to the top of the climb or something like that. And it was a great help for me, especially when navigating new hikes and going out into uncharted territory. The way you add these is you add them in the Garmin Connect app. Right now, you can import a GPX track into Garmin Connect, so you can go to my website and get one of my hike guides, take the GPX file, bring it in, make it a course. It won't bring the waypoints in. So if there are waypoints along a course that might be water sources or summits or whatever it might be, they won't come in with that import. You have to set them manually. I hope that changes at some point, but still, it's a little bit of extra work right now, but it is a very cool feature up ahead. I'm glad they put it in. I hope it gets rolled out to more devices. Another handy little feature when you create a course is something called Climb Pro. Essentially what it'll do is it will get all of the climbs that are on your course, and it'll give you a little readout. It'll show you how far you are on the climb, and you can cycle through the different climbs on the course to kind of get a heads up for that. So I found that very helpful on like longer climbs when I'm trying to pace my effort. And this isn't new. This was on the Fenix 6. It just looks a lot better on the Epix than it did on the Fenix, and it's a handy little tool if you're not familiar with these watches that you have when you're navigating or following a course out on the trail or on the road or whatever it might be. All right, the battery. This is another big one, and there's major differences between the Fenix 7 and the Epix. So again, the Epix AMOLED screen burns much more battery than the Fenix 7. The Fenix 7 also offers a solar option, of which this is. Here's what I found in general. You can basically track about 65 to 100 hours of activities on the Fenix 7. So that means you're tracking with GPS on. So you're tracking a hike or a run or whatever it might be. 65 to 100 hours with solar on in varying conditions before you run the battery down to zero, which is pretty incredible. You can run a 24-hour race, you can do Western states or whatever and have this running and it's fine. The Epix was still very respectable, 20 to 33 hours of activity tracking. So you could do a 24-hour, ultra run, and you could still use the Epix with the better screen, which is great. Now for everyday use, which is when you don't have the GPS on and you're just doing things like the heart rate and the sleep tracking, Essentially for the Epix, I could exercise between 30 and 60 minutes a day. I could do a long hike on the weekend, so somewhere between 6 and 10 hours, and use it every day with sleep and everything, heart rate tracking, and get about a week between recharges on the Epix. For the Fenix 7X Sapphire Solar, I could get about 3 weeks before I had to recharge it. So vastly different, but I think 1 week for the Epix is very, very respectable, especially considering an Apple Watch, which has the same type of screen. You can only track an activity for 6 or 7 hours, and you have to recharge it every day. So the Epix was great in that respect. Now there's things you can do to get more out of the battery. Like I mentioned on the Epix, you can turn that always on off, and you can get even more. You can get rid of multi-bands to save some juice. You can do that on both of them. You can also set up power profiles where you turn off certain features. So if you're not using music, or if you're not using Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, you can turn those features off overall, and also when you're doing a specific activity. So for example, when I'm hiking, I turn Wi-Fi off because I don't need to be looking for a Wi-Fi signal then. So there's things you can do to get even more battery life out of this. You can put them in sleep mode, where it essentially shuts down and just does the essential things at night. I'd recommend turning off things like the pulse oximeter, which for me, I heard that this one was better, but I still get figures that are consistently 2 or 3, if not more percent lower than a professional grade pulse oximeter. The thing to know about the pulse oximeter, as a side note, is that you need to hold your wrist perfectly still, and ideally it needs to be horizontal like this for you to get an accurate reading. And if you're moving around and you just wanted to know your pulse oxygen, it's not going to work, or it's not going to work well. So turn that off. Not worth it unless you are doing something like climatization, where you really want to do it and you're spending time measuring it specifically. Then it's okay, but otherwise I don't really find a big need for that. So battery life overall, spectacular. One of the differences I didn't mention about the Fenix is that it has an external LED flashlight on the top crown of the watch. And I've seen other reviews where people sort of hype that up. I didn't find it very helpful as somebody who hikes. As somebody who hikes or goes out on like trail runs, I always have a headlamp with me, and this little flashlight is nothing compared to a headlamp. It would come in handy as a backup. I enjoy having it there just in case. It does have different brightness levels. It does have a red light. I went camping once and I turned on the red light when I had to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and this was perfect. I didn't have to get my headlamp. I just sort of used this, and I was able to get out of the tent and take care of business. So it does have its uses. You could use it as a strobe, maybe if you're running at night, or if you're in a rescue situation and you want to get noticed, the strobe is good. But flashlight was not a big deal to me as a hiker and an outdoors person. Good in terms of having a backup maybe. Other thing to note is that the Epix doesn't have that external LED flashlight, but it does have a basically a watch face flashlight, and that works the same as like a smartphone flashlight, where you light the whole screen up white. You can hold it up like that. Again, that'll work in a pinch. Those things burn the battery down, not the greatest. Other thing to note before I jump off of this topic is that the flashlight on the Fenix is only available on the 7X model. The other models don't have the flashlight. So if it's something that's important to you, it's good as a backup, but otherwise, not a huge deal. So that's the feature set. I just want to share with you how I end up using the watch most of the time. I use it daily for my sleep tracking, my heart rate. I use the body battery to tell whether I am, if I have gas in the tank or not. I use it for runs, I use it for bike rides, for walks. I track all of that as part of my exercise. And the nice thing is I can go to the Garmin Connect website. I have a custom dashboard set up, and I can get a quick snapshot of my health and my activities in one place. I don't have to mess around with like different apps syncing up and all of the craziness that you kind of do with an Apple Watch if you have different systems going on. So that's really nice. Generally, I will plan a hike out before. I'll create a course for it. I'll load it onto the watch, but when I'm on the trail, I don't use the course to navigate. Generally, at that point, I've done enough research that I kind of know where I'm going. I know where the junctions are. I've looked at a map. If it's dark out, or if I'm on like really sketchy or off-trail situations, then I'll use the course. But otherwise, I leave it off in case I need it for an emergency, because I don't like all the alerts, and it doesn't really do much for me to have that purple line there. But if you are not confident in where you're going, the course is a great way to have that. And again, I'll have a whole video on navigating with this coming shortly, but that's generally how I use the watch. Is it overkill for what I need? Probably, but I do enjoy having all those health stats and having these navigation tools and the maps there as a backup if I do need them out on the trail. Now, who is this watch for? Before I get into it, if I could just ask you, if you're going to buy one of these watches or anything from Amazon or REI, if you could use my affiliate links, I get a small percentage of the sale and you don't pay anything extra. Those links are underneath the video and also on the guide page, so thank you for that. I depend on all of those sales to make all this happen, so thank you, thank you, thank you. First off, if you just want to be able to navigate a hike, you do not need a Garmin Fenix or an Epix. You can do that if you hike in good conditions on your smartphone. Just get an app like Gaia GPS, download the offline maps, put your track on there, and you will be fine. If you hike in more challenging conditions where it's going to be wet and you maybe can't use a touchscreen, or you want something more rugged so you can kind of thrash it and smash it a little bit, getting a cheap GPS like an eTrex is going to work fine. The GPS positioning system is not going to be as accurate as these, but if you just want something to navigate with and you want to know, like if you come to a trail junction, do I go right or left, or am I on the line or am I not on the line, you don't necessarily need this level of accuracy and reliability. You can get by with something much less expensive like an eTrex or even a used GPS Map 64 or like even a Fenix 3 if those are still around. An older Fenix would be fine. If you have an older Fenix, if you have a Fenix 5 or a 6 and you're happy with it, stick with it. The tracks will be more accurate on these newer watches, but it's not a huge deal if it's not a huge deal for you. The functionality is largely the same aside from like the touchscreen, a little bit more battery life. But if I had one of those older ones, you know, I think I would just stick with it. I don't need a hyper accurate track most of the time, and those units work great, and I would, you know, enjoy them until they die. If you're an Apple Watch user and you're sick of the kind of crummy battery life on the Apple Watch and you want something more outdoors focused that has that nice screen, the Garmin Epix is going to be the perfect watch for you. It's going to be a little bit of a jump to get into the Garmin ecosystem and just kind of wrap your head around it. But I find that my Epix is sort of the hybrid between my old Fenix and my Apple Watch, and I love it, and I just use the Epix now. So Apple Watch users, you will love the Epix. Now, if you don't want to spend all the money on these very expensive watches, there are other alternatives that you can get where you can track your workouts. You can get a lot of the same features like body battery and all the health level tracking, but not spend the big bucks. I would recommend checking out the Garmin Instinct or Instinct 2. They don't have maps, but they do have a lot of the other bells and whistles, and they do allow you to load a course onto the watch, and you can basically see if you're on the track line or not on the track line. And I use that method of navigation for years and years. It was fine. That in conjunction with the paper map will basically let you know whether you're where you need to be or not need to be. You can't pan around the map and make navigation decisions on the watch, but it's not a big deal, and you can save a lot of money just by getting an Instinct 2 or an Instinct. I'll put links to those underneath the video, so check those out if you might want to save a few bucks. All right, so let's say you've gotten this far, you want to get an Epix or a Fenix 7. Here's what I would say. Get the Epix if the battery life is acceptable. If you're cool with going a week or so between recharging it, the screen on the Epix has been much better. Like I said, I have both of these watches. I never look at the Fenix. I've had them both on. I can't wait to take this off right after I shoot this video. But the Epix is much better. It's a little bit smaller. It's the medium size of the Garmin Fenix range. It feels a little better. It's not as heavy on my arm as the Fenix 7X Sapphire Solar, but again, the battery life is what I sacrifice. But for me, the screen is worth it, the size is worth it. If you really need long battery life, like say you're a thru hiker and you want to just go out and hike and you don't have to worry about recharging this is a great option, especially if you want to load tracks on there and maybe get a cross check of where you are on the PCT or something like that. Otherwise, I would say the screen is so inferior on the Fenix that unless you really need the battery life on this one, get an Epix. I also just want to note that with the Epix, I went on a couple of camping trips, 2 or 3 days. I drained the battery down. I was simply able to recharge it overnight with a battery charger, the same USB battery charger that I use to charge my camera and my phone and all those things. It's really not a big deal just to carry another, 10-gram cable in your pack to charge the Epix if you need to. So something to consider, definitely the Epix. I can't see Garmin releasing a Fenix 8 with this transflective screen. They're gonna have to do something for the screen because the Epix, again, just blows it away. And just remember, if you're going to get one of these, get the Sapphire version. You have the scratch-resistant glass, you have the multi-band capabilities on the watch, and you have the extra memory. Definitely worth spending the incremental, couple $100 on top of the already massive few $100 that you'd spend on a watch like this anyway. So that's what I got. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, if you could give me a thumbs up, and if you could use my affiliate links to buy these watches, any watches, or anything from Amazon or REI, helps me out a ton and allows me to do this without any help or assistance from Garmin. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I will do my best to answer them. But otherwise, I'm going to create a navigation video now. Stay tuned for that. That'll be coming soon. And once I'm done that, I'm going to sell my Garmin Fenix 7X, keep the Epix, and see what comes next in the Garmin pipeline. All right, guys, I'll see you out there.